Today, we have an exceptional guest, a seasoned industry leader, a product development leader as well, with a wealth of experience in giants like Comcast, American Express. And in fact, I had the privilege to work with Jill closely in American Express. She was not just my boss, but also a mentor who greatly influenced my professional journey. And just to call out, Jill's expertise isn't just confined to the corporate world. She is also an active contributor and board member of the Valley Forge Mustang Club. Today, we'll delve into Jill's experience. We will especially focus on how she has successfully managed geographically dispersed teams and navigated cultural aspects into leadership and foster collaboration to drive successful outcomes. Jill, welcome to the show. And we are really thrilled to have you here. Before we get started, you want to add something, Jill?
Oh, well, just like thanks for inviting me. The invite came out of the blue. I'm like, I haven't talked to you, Ashish, in a number of years. So
Yes.
then when I saw the topic, I'm like, oh, this is gonna be fun. So glad to be here.
Great. So we'll get into the questions. I think the first question which I have in my list is, what are the top challenges that immediately come into your mind while leading the geographically distant teams?
There's so much to leading teams that are not next to you. And in the early 2000s, late 90s, we focused so much on co-location. And now, especially post-COVID, it's the opposite, right? People are everywhere. And I think from my perspective, a lot of the challenges have gone away with like everybody getting used to virtual work. I think it used to be that some of the challenges were like, folks who were not in the room got ignored, right? And I think that's a lot less now. But it certainly exists, right? How many meetings have we all been in where you've got like that one or two people up on the screen and everybody else's back is to the screen, right? I mean, we've all experienced that. The biggest thing is the obvious one, right? It's time zone difference. And, it's one thing if you're in the same time zone, which does happen, right? I've had folks in Toronto and, they're the same time zone or one off. That's easy. But if they're in Europe, India, and like I'm on the East Coast in the US, I've had people in Australia, that is, the opposite of any semblance of easy, right? It's the opposite end of the clock. For me and you guys, I know I've worked with folks in Phoenix, which is the same deal, right? It's the opposite end of the clock. That I think is kind of the hardest that I see. And along with that is, if you're at the opposite end of the clock, out of sight, out of mind is a real thing, especially if you're not part of a team, right? That's overseas, right? If you're just an individual contributor, you have to work extra hard to stay relevant and stay part of the team. That's not where you are. And then, does that team or people have everything they need to be successful, right? It's one thing to say you hired a bunch of people in this city on the other side of the planet, but if they don't have everything they need to be successful, then they're not going to be successful, right?
Right.
And I would say even more recently, like as we've grown teams and as we've started to better equip them and give them more autonomy, it's become actually more important, but equally difficult to keep a good pulse on how the health of the team is and what the morale's like on the team, right? It's like, it's one thing, when you kind of see the team through a local leader, right? But they're not always well representing like the team as a whole.
Nice.
So those are my top three, or maybe there was 12. I'm not sure.
No, that makes a lot of sense, Jill. I think one thing what you mentioned is that like we live apart from the world, right? We stay in India, you guys are in US, and I think we all have reported into people, at least who are not sitting in the same geography as us, not sitting in the same culture as us, right? We have grown into different culture have, I would say, different characteristics, right? And different slangs as well. So have you come across any situation where you have seen cultural difference made a lot of difference? Like something would have been said, but somebody misunderstood and something happened. Like, do you remember of any incident like that?
Yeah, you know, Ashish is smiling because he's seen me step into a few potholes here and there. We, like everyone on this call, we all speak English, right?
Yes.
But we don't speak the same English. And, you know, I've had, you know, when Ashish worked with me, I had a team in the UK, a team in the US, you know, obviously, and then, you know, a team in a couple different places in India. And even though we all speak English, we don't, right? The way we use words, the way we form structures, even the words we choose to use, and even some of the words that we use don't exist in the other dictionaries, right?
Yes.
There were a couple of examples with one team in India. I had to actually go and look up the word because I'm like, that's not a real word. And lo and behold, in the dictionary, it's like it is a real word in India, right? So there's that, and also like colloquialisms and body language is different,
Yeah.
right?
Mm.
Um, we've probably all heard, you know, you know, um, yeah, an American in the UK, the American word for bum bag is a bit vulgar in the UK,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
But there's other things like that, you know. So I think language is really interesting. It's fascinating and it's fun to watch, especially for someone who's like never been introduced to that nuance. But you know, that's a thing. And depending on who you're talking to, like it may come across as being, you know, rude or insensitive or not caring enough to learn about the person you're talking to, right? Even though it's in most cases just, you know, an innocent, you know, mistake. But then, you know, there's also differences in expectations, right?
Mm.
And this is probably one of the biggest things that I've personally noticed is, you know, whether it's the US, India, Australia, Japan, even Canada, which is really close to the US, right? You know, both like language, culture, not just geography. There's different expectations in work-life balance, right? Like in the US, in tech, if you get a phone call at 2 o'clock in the morning because something broke, that's kind of expected. That's not true everywhere, right?
Mm.
And you know, in many places it might actually be illegal too, right? You know, it's like in France, for example, and I think now Germany, and I think I heard like Australia is doing the same thing, right? Like that kind of phone call after hours doesn't need to be answered, and it might even
Mm.
be illegal to make it, right? So there's those kinds of things. And then just like the way we talk to each other in the US, especially in the Northeast, we tend to be more direct, not be super fluffy in our language. And in other countries, that's not the case, or it is to varying
Yeah.
degrees, right?
Mm.
And like the way, you know, two folks from New York City or Boston might talk to each other might be like patently offensive somewhere else.
No, so I think we were taught in the school that language is never the barrier, but when you work in MNC or when you work with people across different cultures, you realize language is the first barrier. You need to understand what they're saying and how they're saying, and there are so many nuances to it.
Oh yeah, yeah. And you know, like in, you know, Europe, I think, you know, even, you know, if we're not speaking the same language, I think there may be a bigger difference than like the US and India. India
Mm.
tends to be a little bit more direct, but maybe not
Mm.
as, right? But still, like there's also like you need to get across like the intent and like,
Yeah.
you know, your personality. Like I'm a fairly direct person, but like I'm also pretty nice most of the time. So like you got to get that through too, right?
Yes. And thanks for covering that. I think work-life balance is important, and especially post COVID, it become like a very frequently used term, right? I think thanks for covering that aspect. I think I have one related question, like right? So you have managed really people from India, and then in UK we had this team, and then yes, you have your peers and subordinates in US as well. Have you observed that regional distances influence the career interest as well?
Yes and no. People are people, and people have aspirations. Local culture does have a big impact, right? Like
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
historically in India, for example, people like want to see like that continual progression at a fairly regular pace. I think
Exactly.
that's changing a bit over time. But like historically, like if someone didn't get a promotion every 12, 18 months, like they were kind of in the market looking for a new role. Where like in Europe, it's maybe a slower progression and there's
Yeah.
maybe a higher value on like time outside of work with family, where someone else might be like putting in 100 hours because they want to get ahead. And I think like there's both, that cultural aspect, you know, but also like the personal drive, right?
Yeah.
Like
Definitely.
especially today in a lot of countries, um, the people that are in the workforce are the first generation to have a college diploma, right? They're the first generation to do a lot of things. And with that comes a lot of expectations, right? And that desire to get ahead. Or like in my case, both my parents, were firstborn in this country. Their parents were immigrants. My parents were the first in our, lineage to graduate college. My dad's a PhD, so it's like that continual drive to like not disappoint as well. And I think that's pretty universal too,
Yeah.
right? But how
Yes.
does it affect career choices? Um, I think that drive, whether it's like culturally influenced or from something in your personal life, I think is that drive that determines more than like where you're located. And we do see, all over the world in every country, people who like naturally gravitate towards leadership roles or individual contributor roles. And like as engineers, some percentage of us become leaders. But at the end of the day, like, why did we all become engineers? Because we like solving hard problems, right?
I think good answer. I think because I think I can use this forum to uh, accept the fact that I used to be that person. So okay, I think a few years back, I used to be that person who
I seem to recall that.
yes. So kind of I used to just think that okay, if I spend 1.5 year or 2 years in a role, there should be a progression to the next one, right? And then after spending last 3 4 years into product management or maybe in general with different set of people, I kind of learned that this may not be the right choice, to be honest, because there are various factors. If you want to grow to the next level, there are various factors. I think we can have a separate session on that. But yes, to spot on to the point, I think one of the victim of that, you can say,
Is on the call with us
that
right now.
philosophy is me actually. So, but thanks for that. Thanks for sharing that, Jill. Yep.
Well, and
Uh,
it's all of us, right? Like I'm in a moment in my life where, my son is in high school, right?
Yeah.
I'm getting older. I'm about to get married again. And I feel like I have like 8 full-time jobs, none of which generate an income. So like, it's like that, every once in a while you end up in that pivot point where you're like, huh, what do I want to do with the rest of my life? Right?
Right.
It happens. And it's
uh,
not, it's good. It's good.
Yeah.
You only live
mm,
once, right?
mm. No, one thing I always wonder is that progression or no progression, I think to manage a team, doesn't matter remote or in the same location. I guess trust is really important, right? Your team needs to trust you, especially during COVID, where everybody was remote in terms of doesn't matter you are in US or you are in India and US, everybody was remote. So what do you think, let's say, handling a remote team is more difficult or, a team in the same location is more difficult? What are your learnings there during the COVID time or before and after COVID time?
Um, well, if everyone's virtual, then it's equally difficult, right?
That's true,
Um,
right? Everybody's virtual.
yeah. Now, remote, not remote, um, each have their own kind of pros and cons. Um, folks who are with you every day, you see every day. So like the downside of that is you see them every day and you see all the mistakes they make
Yes.
and you see you see the things they don't want you to see, which is good. And for folks who are remote, like the inverse is true, right? You don't see all their successes. I've had a few folks who've direct reported to me who I had no idea half of what they were working on, right? Because it was outside of their normal job duties. But it turned out like they were like super involved with like, local stuff in the office, helping to organize, company-wide or tech-wide events and things like that. And I had no idea, right? Because he didn't communicate it to me. And I think like, how do you build trust to your questions? Like, it's all communication, right? You have to communicate, but it's bidirectional, right? As your leader, I can't be the only one communicating to you. And if the inverse is true, where you're communicating to me and I'm not communicating back, then there's no relationship there, right? And I think like building that relationship, building that trust is, super important. Which one's more difficult? Obviously, we're leading people who you can't see, are. And I think, one of the things that I think changed momentarily was before COVID, there was an expectation that people who worked for you saw you in person every once in a while. And then, I think until maybe like 2 years ago, that had kind of gone on pause and now it's back again. So you see a lot of travel. But I think like that in-person connection, whenever you can make it, goes a super long way. It's like I've had folks who worked for me for years and had never met me in person. And when we finally met, after a week-long trip, they're like, wow, I know you so much better now. And it's not that they
I
didn't
agree.
know me. It was they had an appreciation for like the whole person, not just like the two-dimensional, poorly lit, pixelated version they see on the screen, right? And I think there's still no great replacement for that in-person connection. So whatever you can do to like build that personal connection, I think goes a super long way towards trust. But trust is continually earned, right? And is easily lost. So you have to continually work on that. Um, when you're managing, these remote teams though, like I talked a lot about communication, but it's not just like verbal communication, it's in writing. And once it's in writing, like that gets so tough because then like, did she mean this? Did he mean that? Did he mean to say it this way or that way? Like the
Yeah,
scrutiny of like the actual word, right? Because we tend to be more direct in writing, not
right.
less. And to get that one sentence in Slack with a period, it's like, are they mad? Did they mean it the way I took it? And like you go talk to the person, it's like, no, I just mean this, right? Like take it literally. So I think like you got to work on that relationship so those kinds of misunderstandings don't happen.
When you need to implement a change across geographically multiple teams actually, right? And then there are strategies which you have to just make sure you gauge, and you make sure that you kind of record regional reactions and all those things, right? For example, if there is a work from home policy, or there are local laws as well, right? So how do you find difficult, like is there any example you want to share from your past experience?
So, so implementing a change globally,
Yeah.
um, or remotely. One of you kind of touched on it. One of the things that I think as leaders we don't learn much about until you're on the job is that difference in
Yeah.
local laws, right? It's like I know the U.S. laws pretty well. Um, I've learned sometimes the hard way, India and some pieces of Europe and some pieces of Australia and the Philippines, right? And Canada, I guess, right? Um, and like how, you know, on the job means that you stepped into some place that you shouldn't have, right? So like in the UK, if I want to make, a change that significantly changes someone's job description, there is a legal process for doing that, right? And, Germany is the same way, a lot of Europe's the same way. But the US and India, it's not, right? You care, I care, nobody else really cares. I think that's changing over time, but knowledge of the laws and what you can do, what you can't do, how, if there's approvals you need to get, I think is really important. Implementing that change, like once you've identified what the change is, it's been approved, you can tell your team, this is what I'm doing. That will almost always fall on its face.
Correct.
Right? Solicit their input, right? If people feel like they had a say, then they'll be more likely to be along for the ride. Now, in a large team, it's not always possible, right? I've led teams that are multiple thousands of people. You're not going to go and say 2,000 people, what do you think of this change, right? But you might go and say, hey, leaders, here's what I'm thinking. What do you think? And then as you communicate it to the team, like trying to bring them along as best you can. And obviously the larger the team, the less, personal interactions there are. But it comes back to what we talked about before, is like trust is huge, right? If people trust that you're making a change for the best interest of them or the organization, or it will somehow benefit them, they're more likely to go along for the ride, right? What you need to avoid is change fatigue, cynicism from developing, morale problems within the team. And it's so easy to get there, right? We've all been there. Everyone who's led teams for a while has seen that happen.
Right.
Sometimes you have change that you inspire. Other times you have change that was forced upon you, and you can't predict that. And we were, a couple months ago, 6 months ago, 9 months ago, I was talking to some folks about change fatigue. Right? We had a new leader, I had a new leader. Then, the team itself had recently had a new leader. My leader did a reorg, my leader's leader did a reorg, and I was about to do a reorg. Like, holy moly, that is a lot of change all at once, right? And like all at once in like a 6-month period, it's a lot, because people get into you and people get into kind of this like, oh my God, it's not settling down. There's no stability. And like, what happens when there's no stability? People start looking for new jobs, right? And that's kind of like, you can't always control it, but like the best you can. And I find like when implementing these kinds of changes, especially if there's a lot going on around you and the team, like just be a person. And, sometimes change is hard, and just admitting that like it affects you too, right? Within some reason, because you also need to inspire confidence, right? But like being human is not a bad thing. On the flip side, the team that's remote, like you have to keep tabs on how things are going, right? Like, what's the morale like? Do people, are people getting it? Are they on board with it? Do they have questions about it? Are they not on board with it? I found it useful, especially when the team like direct reports to me, to recruit folks who are other leaders who are on the ground but maybe not on the team, right? It helps me as a leader kind of keep my ear to the ground and understand how things are going. And then, like if I know that people are upset, I can try to address that. Or if I know that people are feeling like there's a lack of stability, I may not be able to do much to address it, but I can at least have the discussion in the open, which just having that in the open, I think sometimes changes the dynamic. To answer your question?
It's answered. I think I also want to add and emphasize on the fact that, I think you mentioned very right that, okay, sometime, you have to let your team know that this change is good for you. But I have seen instances like when the team actually they're not so educated on the change, and they think it's not good for them. But eventually, when it's forced to them, they realize eventually, yes, it was a good change. Now things are kind of,
Yeah.
things are working.
Yeah,
So
it comes back to the importance of communication, right?
communication, yes, yes,
And if you're a leader of leaders, you have to trust that the people that work for you are in fact communicating the message that you need communicated in a way that
yes,
their people need to hear it. And you're right, that doesn't always happen.
correct.
I try not to always be like the talking head, right? And whenever there's a large change, I try to put myself out there even more than
Yeah,
normal, just so that it's like people. I think when there's consistency, it at least helps folks to kind of feel a little bit more confident about things.
all right.
I think one thing which I always want to ask, and I have gone through myself personally as well on the other side of the table, where somebody from across the seas taking the interview, and sometimes we face a lot of issues in understanding the language, understanding the slang, understanding the accent, right? Like, how do you feel about it? You have scaled, you have led thousands of people. So, what are the challenges you face during, say, hiring a talent, possibly from across the sea, India or UK, while you are in US, right? How do you manage that?
That's a tough one. Um, when and COVID helped on this one, because we learned we learned how to hire people over
Yeah,
video. I had never hired people that I had never met before, until COVID, and I think that gave us like some like settling with it, made us a little more comfortable. But yeah, hiring in other countries is different, right? And it's not just like I'm only like meeting you over video. The whole process of recruiting is not the same, in every industry. It's not the same in every country. Um, I was thinking, as I was kind of thinking through this topic, I was like, well, one of the challenges that we had was it's pretty standard in technology that we introduce like a testing aspect into hiring for engineers. But in a lot of countries, the second that that's present, that person drops out of the funnel when they might have been like the best person for the job. They drop out of the funnel because like they're like, I'm interviewing with 10 other companies. I'm not going to be bothered, right? Not that they wouldn't pass, but like I'm not going to be bothered. So as the hiring leader, like you need to really be thoughtful about like what's the process, right? Is there enough interviews? Is there too many interviews? Are you doing things that are going to, you know, make people not want to go through the process, right? And if you do that, then you might be disqualifying, the best people that would apply. And then what? You end up selecting among the folks that are in front of you, which may not actually be the folks that you want to be in front of you. Um, Compensation is huge,
yeah,
right? Not just because we all need to make money to pay for our mortgages, but the way in which we think about it can be quite different from country to country, right? Like in the US is pretty common, you have a base comp, maybe you have a bonus, maybe you also have like, annual RSUs or stock options or whatever, depending on what level you are in the company. And different companies kind of think differently about how they use those tools, and then other
correct.
benefits, right? Where like, you know, somewhere else it might just be like this is what you're getting paid, and somewhere else it might be like, you know, more components than those three, which I think is like often the case, like in India.
Yes,
And then there's other things, right? Like in the US, it's pretty uncommon to have like maternity benefits, for example. But in other countries, like that's the law. So you have to be aware of those things too. So I think like it's not just the recruiting aspect, but like that full like the compensation, like what would be normal? How do you want to position within the market relative to like who you see as not your competitors, but your competitors for the people that you're targeting, right? It's like if you're targeting big tech, you need to compensate like big tech, right? If you're, if you're a bank, that could be quite different, right? If you're a telco, that could be quite different. So like, you have to be attractive to the people. I find like hiring leaders to be more difficult remote than hiring individual contributors. Like individual contributors, you can get like a pretty good sense for who they are, what they're about, what their background's like, kind of their basic competencies. And even without doing a test, you can kind of weed out like are they who they say they are. Leaders, like it's harder. And I think I've had less success in hiring leaders remotely than locally, but you have the conversation, you get the right people involved. And if there's someone local that you can recruit to help, like I think that just makes it so much more likely that you're going to be successful.
Well, thanks for that, Jill. I think spot on again. That's all we have today